For more than 100 years, the photograph was nothing more than background. It lay in a gray archival box in the climate-controlled basement of a New England historical society, one sepia rectangle among thousands. The label on the back read, in neat fountain pen script, "The Harrows, June 1909. That was all anyone thought they needed to know. A wealthy mill owner, his fashionable wife, their well-dressed children. A frozen moment from the era when people posed stiffly and took photographs as seriously as funerals. If you had pulled it from the box any time before the 21st century, you would have seen exactly what generations of interns had seen before you." The Harrow parlor was a catalogue of Edwardian comfort. A piano with sheet music stacked neatly on the stand. Heavy velvet curtains framing a bay window that let in a carefully moderated light. Patterned wallpaper climbing the walls in sober stripes. A Persian rug sprawled across polished floorboards, the kind that cost more than a year's wages in the mills that paid for it. On the far wall, oil portraits in gilded frames watched everything with permanent, aristocratic boredom. At the center, arranged like a display in a shop window, stood the family. Thomas Harrow himself occupied the left side of the composition, one hand resting on the back of an upholstered armchair, the other slipped casually into his waistcoat. His expression was the kind of solemn that men of his station cultivated for newspapers and business portraits. Firm jaw, steady eyes, as if the camera were a board of directors to be impressed. Beside him sat his wife, Eleanor, in a high-collared dress that chased the latest fashion without looking vulgar. Lace at her throat, a brooch pinned with mother-of-pearl. Her hair was gathered into an elaborate twist that had probably taken the maid an hour to perfect. Her hands, folded in her lap, framed the smallest child. That child, little Henry, age 7, perched on the arm of her chair, hair parted with mathematical precision, sailor suit pressed to razor lines. To Eleanor's right, on a carved wooden chair, sat Rose, 12, already training her posture into the swan-necked elegance expected of a girl who would one day host teas and charity luncheons. At the far right, slightly behind the others, stood Edward, 16, the heir, one hand on the mantelpiece, the other holding a book he almost certainly had not chosen himself. Serious faces, perfectly arranged bodies, no one smiling. To modern eyes, the stiffness read as unhappiness. To 1909, it signaled respectability. You did not grin in a formal portrait any more than you laughed in church. For decades, archivists looked at this and saw a type, not a mystery. Then, in 2024, a graduate researcher named Dr. Amelia Clark needed a typical portrait for an exhibit that was anything but typical. Her project, tentatively titled Invisible Lives of the Industrial Age, aimed to peel back the polished veneer of New England's mill dynasties and show the human cost behind the brick facades and dividend checks. She had already collected photographs of workers' tenements, strike marches, and loom rooms crammed with exhausted girls. What she lacked was the other half of the story, the polished, official family images those same mill owners paid to have taken. The Harrow photograph fit perfectly on paper. Prominent family, clear provenance. Date neatly inscribed. Amelia signed it out of storage, carried it upstairs, and set it under the cool glow of an archivist's lamp. Old photos are like old houses. In dim light, they look solid and simple. Under the right illumination, the cracks begin to show. At first, she saw nothing unusual. The Harrows were, if anything, almost disappointingly textbook. The furniture screamed money. The arrangement screamed propriety. She noted the photographer's stamp in the corner. Whitcomb Studio, Boston, and jotted down dimensions and condition notes. Then the bulb in her desk lamp flickered. She adjusted the angle, lowering the light just enough to throw the room into sharper contrast. Shadows deepened in the corners. Highlights picked out details that had been washed flat a moment earlier. The edge of a picture frame, the sheen on Thomas's cufflinks, the faint grain of the wood paneling, and something by the window. Amelia leaned closer. Behind the family group, half hidden where the bay window met the wall, a shape separated itself from the wallpaper. It resolved, with the awful slowness of old photographs, into a small figure. A child, 8 or 9 perhaps, standing just inside the spill of daylight. Dark hair, plain dress or shirt, hands at their sides, eyes looking straight at the camera. The Harrows did not look at this child. They did not angle their bodies toward them, did not rest a hand on a shoulder, or leave space on a chair. To the composition, the stranger belonged to the room, not the family. But the child's gaze cut directly through a century and landed, unblinking, wherever Amelia's own eyes happened to be. A prickle ran up the back of her neck. She turned down the lamp, then up again, just to be sure it wasn't a trick of light, an overdeveloped patch, a flaw in the emulsion. Under bright illumination, the figure faded into the overall tone. Under softer, angled light, they emerged again, the way bruises do under skin. "Okay," she murmured. "You're real." Archivists are trained to be suspicious. Amelia pulled the photograph from its mount and slid it carefully into a mylar sleeve, then carried it to the imaging lab. There, under a higher resolution scanner and a conservator's magnifying glass, doubt evaporated. The emulsion around the child's outline matched the rest of the print. The shadows thrown by their body fell in the right direction, consistent with the light from the bay window. In a mirror on the opposite wall, their reflection appeared as a faint echo. There was no evidence of retouching, no telltale scraping of a knife or haze of double exposure. Whoever this child was, they had been standing in that parlor on the day the Harrows posed. They had held still through the long seconds of exposure. They had been seen by the camera, if not by history. Amelia straightened up, the hairs on her arms still raised. "Has anyone else noticed this?" she asked the conservator. He peered through his spectacles, squinting at the tiny silhouette. "Never paid it much mind," he said. "Probably just a servant's child, or someone caught in the background." "Servants didn't usually get caught," she countered. "Not in staged portraits. And if they did, they didn't stare directly down the lens." The man shrugged. "You're the social historian." To him, a photograph was an object to be preserved. To her, it was a crime scene. She took the photo back to her desk and opened the Harrow family file. Census sheets, donation lists, a yellowed clipping announcing Edward's engagement in 1918. The household summary from 1910 listed 5 people: Thomas, Eleanor, and the 3 children whose names matched the ones she'd already scrawled in her notebook. No mention of a 4th child. Birth records from the state archives showed 3 live births to Eleanor Harrow, and a note about complications after the youngest. Church baptism registers mirrored the census. Society pages from the Boston papers chronicled the Harrows' dinners and dances and charity events with annoying thoroughness. But never once did a reporter write the words, "and their 4 children." Amelia sat back, tapping her pen against her front teeth. Either every piece of official documentation was wrong, or the child in the photograph did not exist. At least, not in any way the Harrows were willing to admit. She turned back to the image, letting her historian's eye roam over compositional choices she had once dismissed as stuffy convention. The stranger by the window was not dressed like the Harrow children. Their clothing was neat but plain, lacking the lace collars and decorative buttons of the others. They stood slightly behind the plane of the family, not quite centered, not quite concealed. Enough to be recorded, not enough to be acknowledged. On the windowsill, next to their hand, lay something small and rectangular. A card? A folded note? In the grain of the photograph, it was nothing more than a pale smudge. But it had been placed there on purpose, within arm's reach of the only person in the room who did not officially exist. Amelia felt that prickle again, sharper this time. In lecture halls, social historians talk about liminal figures and interstitial spaces, people who live between categories, neither fully included nor fully excluded. Here in sepia was one, present but peripheral, visible but unrecorded, standing in the literal border between the polished interior and the bright, unknowable world beyond the glass. She wrote 2 words in the margin of her notebook: window child. Later that afternoon, as the building emptied and the muffled sounds of the city seeped in through the old stone walls, Amelia found herself alone with the photograph again. The overhead lights clicked off on a timer, plunging the room into a soft gloom. Only her desk lamp remained, its circle of light isolating the Harrows and their unwanted guest in an island of attention. "If you were nobody," she said quietly, "why are you here?" The child, of course, did not answer. But the question was out now, hanging in the air between archives and ghosts. Most photographs of wealthy families from 1909 told one story: stability, order, the right people in the right places. This one, under the right light, whispered another. Somewhere just outside the frame of official records, another life had been lived in that house, a life that brushed the edges of privilege without ever being allowed to sit at its center. For Amelia, and for the film she would eventually shape from this discovery, that was all the invitation she needed: to follow that gaze from the window into ledgers and letters, to step through the glass and into the spaces where official history went silent, to find out who the window child was and why the Harrows allowed them into the picture, but not onto the page. The archivist's joke was that paper never lies. Amelia Clark knew better. Paper lied all the time, it just did it politely, by leaving things out. By the end of her first week with the Harrows, she had a neat stack of evidence that agreed on exactly one thing. In 1909, there were 3 Harrow children, and only 3. The 1910 federal census listed them in orderly typewriter lines: Edward 17, Rose 13, Henry 8. The city directory placed the family at a Commonwealth Avenue address with 2 domestic servants. Parish records from St. Andrew's Episcopal Church showed 3 baptisms, 3 confirmations, 3 sets of Sunday school attendance marks. The birth registry, cross-checked twice, recorded no mysterious 4th baby, no infant lost in a gap between entries. On paper, the window child did not exist. Amelia spread copies of those records around the photograph on her desk like a jury of witnesses. On every sheet, the Harrows were exactly what they appeared at first glance to be: rich, respectable, contained. But photographs, unlike documents, are terrible liars. She turned the picture under the lamp once more, watching the child at the window surface from the sepia grain as the angle of light changed. The face was too soft in focus to read with certainty. Early 20th century lenses weren't kind to background detail, but the outline was unmistakable. A narrow chin, dark hair parted in the middle, hands resting, not fidgeting, at their sides. "Where did you come from?" she murmured. The obvious answer, that the child belonged to the servants, didn't quite fit. In most formal portraits of the era, household staff were either excluded entirely or relegated to clearly marked positions. Nursemaids standing behind their charges, butlers in the background with silver trays. When servants' children did slip into frame, they did it the way all children of the poor did, while moving, blurred, half turned away. This child stood still. The pose was awkward but deliberate, like someone who had been told exactly where to stand and then ordered not to move. They were not playing. They were participating. That raised a question more interesting than any census column. Who would you allow into your parlor, but not into your family? Amelia's first real lead came from a place she almost didn't bother to check: the household account book. It sat, unremarkable, in the Harrow manuscript collection, bound in dark leather that had gone velvety with age. On the inside cover, in Eleanor Harrow's looping hand, was written, "Household Expenses, 1900-1915. The entries began predictably: coal deliveries, grocer's bills, dressmaker's fees. Then larger items: new pianoforte for Rose, Edward's school uniform, Henry's birthday party, cakes and ices. The Harrow's life, in ink. Amelia skimmed through the first years, letting her eye catch the rhythm of Eleanor's record-keeping. The woman had been meticulous, almost to the point of obsession. Every coin that left the household passed through her pen. In November 1908, the rhythm broke. A new line appeared, in the same hand, but with a different, sharper pressure. Monthly provision for C, 8 euros. Amelia's pulse quickened. She flipped forward. December. Provision for C, 8 euros. January 1909. The same, with an extra line beneath it. Boots for C, 175. February. Provision for C, 8 euros. Medicine for C, 0.60. The pattern continued all the way to 1913. Every month, provision for C. Sometimes alone, sometimes accompanied by other more specific expenses. C's school books, C's winter coat, doctor's visit C. Whoever C was, they had lived in that house for at least 4 years. The amounts were revealing. $8 a month in 1909 was not a fortune, but it was not nothing. Enough to feed and clothe a child modestly. Less than the Harrows spent on their own offspring, whose entries came in larger, more extravagant bursts, but more than they spent on charity donations, listed elsewhere in the book as alms or church offerings. It was support, not largesse. Ongoing responsibility. Amelia paged back to the months before the first C entry, looking for anything that might explain the change. On October 14, 1908, she found it. Donation to victims of mill accident, $300. Funeral arrangements for 3 workers, $90. Her stomach dropped. She knew that date. She had seen it 2 days earlier, on microfilm. The Boston Chronicle's front-page headline from October 15, 1908 had screamed, "3 killed in mill disaster, spinning machine failure at Harrow Textiles." The article detailed, with the cool cruelty of early industrial reporting, how a malfunctioning machine had torn loose and crushed workers in the spinning room. Among the dead, it noted, was Mrs. Mary O'Malley, widow, age 32, survived by 1 daughter, Catherine, aged 8. At the time, Amelia had read it as context, another example of the human cost behind Thomas Harrow's comfortable life. Now, with the account book open in front of her, the lines connected themselves with almost painful clarity. October. Accident. November. Provision for C. She flipped forward again, searching for more than a single letter. It took until the first Christmas entry. December 24th, 1910. Gifts. Edward Rose Henry. The amounts were significantly higher. Then on the line below, Christmas doll for Catherine, $3.50. There it was. The C had a name now. Catherine. Amelia sat back, the lamplight haloing the page. Catherine O'Malley, 8 years old, daughter of a mill worker, killed in an accident at her employer's factory, was not in the census. She was not in the church records. She was not in the society pages. But she was in the Harrow household accounts. She was in Eleanor's private correspondence, which Amelia would later read and discover references to the child and our obligations. And she was, undeniably, in the photograph, standing by the window in a plain dress. The realization turned the photograph from a curiosity into a confession. The next documents Amelia pulled from the boxes added layers rather than answers. Letters from Eleanor to her sister in New York spoke of a girl we have taken in for a time, and Thomas's insistence that we maintain clear boundaries. In one, dated just before the photograph was taken, Eleanor wrote, "She is quiet as a shadow and watches everything. The children do not quite know what to make of her. Edward treats her with formal politeness. Rose vacillates between pity and jealousy, and Henry has already tried to sneak her into his games, though their father forbids it. Thomas insists we must not confuse matters by presenting her as one of our own. Yet when she looks at me, there is such hunger in those eyes that I find myself ignoring my own advice." The phrase, "presenting her as one of our own," stuck in Amelia's mind. The photograph, she realized, was the compromise. Catherine was there, but not with them. Included, but edged apart. Visible enough to salve a conscience that balked at hiding her entirely. Distant enough to reassure a world that drew rigid lines around blood and class. The choice of position, by the window, seemed almost cruel in retrospect. She stood literally at the threshold, between inside and outside, between belonging and exclusion. Behind the family, behind the fine furniture, behind the piano and the imported rugs, close enough to be captured, too far to be claimed. Amelia pulled the photo closer and studied the child's face again. Once you knew her name, the image changed. The anonymity dissolved. Catherine O'Malley was no longer an unsettling blur. She was a person, wedged into a space history had not meant to leave for her. The more Amelia learned about the period, the more radical the Harrows' half-measure looked. In 1908, when a worker died in a mill accident, the usual response from owners was a small payout, a perfunctory letter of regret, and a new hire. Children like Catherine drifted into orphanages, distant relatives' homes, or the grinding machinery of child labor. Bringing her into the house at all was an act that balanced on the edge between guilt and progressivism. Keeping her name out of official records was an act of fear. Fear of gossip, an industrialist raising a worker's child under his roof. Fear of precedent. If you did this for one orphan of the mills, why not the others? Fear, perhaps, of the questions their own children might ask if they grew up, with a living reminder of what their comfort cost. Amelia found one more piece that made her catch her breath. In a memo from the mill's factory manager to Thomas Harrow, dated months after the accident, the man wrote, "Rumors among the workers regarding your household's care for the O'Malley girl are causing comment. While your charity is commendable, it may be prudent to consider how this appears to those who lost relatives without similar consideration." In red pencil, in the margin, Thomas had written, "Arrangement continues. E. insists. We will manage the consequences." Arrangement, not adoption, not guardianship. An arrangement. A private settlement between a guilty conscience and a dead woman's last obligation. Sitting in the quiet of the archive, Amelia felt a complicated mix of anger and a reluctant respect. The Harrows had done more than most of their peers would have. They had also wrapped that act in layers of secrecy and hierarchy that said, as clearly as any snub at a dinner party, "You are here because of what we owe, not because of who you are." The camera, whether they intended it or not, had refused to keep the secret entirely. In the finished documentary, this would be the turning point. The moment the audience realized the story wasn't about a ghostly extra or a hidden sibling, but about something more morally ambiguous. A rich family's attempt to balance responsibility and reputation by folding the child of a dead worker into their lives just far enough to soothe themselves. For now, in Amelia's notes, it was a line in capital letters. The window child has a name, Catherine. The next questions wrote themselves. What kind of life did Catherine live on the edge of that frame? Did she ever step fully into it? And how, if at all, did the arrangement that began as damage control after a mill accident become the first step in a life that history almost forgot to record? If the Harrow family photograph captured a moment, the mill accident that brought Catherine into their lives captured a fault line. The newspapers described it in the flat, detached language reserved for industrial tragedy. On an October morning in 1908, a spinning frame at Harrow Textiles failed spectacularly. A metal arm, poorly maintained and overworked, snapped free and scythed through the spinning room. 3 workers died where they stood. One of them was Mary O'Malley, 32, Irish, widowed, survived by a single daughter. On the page, Mary was barely a paragraph. In the South End tenements where she'd lived, her death was a hole in the world. Catherine was 8 when her mother left for the mill that day and did not come back. There are no photographs of her then, no diary entries in her own hand, only the bureaucratic echo of her existence. One child, age 8, noted beside her mother's name in a coroner's report. If not for the choices the Harrows made in the weeks that followed, that might have been all history remembered of her. But guilt can be a powerful archivist. We know, from a terse memo between Thomas Harrow and his factory manager, that an immediate solution was needed for the O'Malley child. Orphanages were mentioned, then crossed out. Mrs. Harrow suggests temporary care in our household, the manager wrote, while more suitable arrangements are considered. Matter to be kept discreet to avoid precedent. A few lines in the margin, in Thomas's own hand, sealed Catherine's fate. Proceed. For now. For Catherine, for now, became years. In Eleanor's letters, the first mention is cautious. The girl has arrived, she writes to her sister in November 1908. She is smaller than I expected, and silent in a way that feels too old for her age. The children are curious. Thomas is conflicted. At first, Catherine slept in a narrow bed in a spare room near the servants' quarters, a compromise between charity and distance. Eleanor had insisted on proper linens and a small bookshelf. Thomas, according to another letter, had frowned at the expense but did not veto it. "We cannot put her in the dormitory like a maid," Eleanor argued. "We are not running a boarding house. We are correcting a wrong." Correcting a wrong. The phrase would surface again and again, like a refrain she used to justify transgressing the invisible boundaries of class. Catherine's first weeks in the house would have been bewildering. She came from cramped rooms that smelled of coal dust and boiled cabbage, from a world where a child's worth was measured in how quickly she could learn to tie threads and dodge belt drives. Now she found herself surrounded by mahogany and embroidered cushions, by servants who were to be respected but not imitated, by rules written in a code she could not yet read. Eleanor's letters trace the slow, awkward choreography of Catherine's integration. "Henry insisted on showing her his toy soldiers," one entry notes. "When I reminded him she is not a plaything but a guest, he replied with disarming logic, 'Guests are allowed to play, aren't they?' Thomas overheard and later warned me about blurring lines." Rose, at 12, watched Catherine with a wary fascination. She asked if Catherine would be joining them for lessons, Eleanor writes. "I told her that Miss Fairchild will give the girl basic instruction in the mornings, separate from their governess at first." Rose's reaction was complicated. There is a hint of envy that so much attention should be paid to a newcomer. Only Edward, nearly grown and conscious of the way the world watched him as his father's heir, kept his distance. He greeted Catherine with cold politeness at meals, then retreated into school books and cricket. In another home, in another story, his standoffishness might have been villainy. Here it was armor. Any acknowledgement beyond the bare minimum risked being read as endorsement of an arrangement his father was trying desperately to keep from becoming a precedent or a scandal. For Catherine, the house must have felt like a stage where everyone else knew their lines. She ate at a side table in the dining room, close enough to hear the family's conversation about politics and concerts, far enough that no guest could mistake her for a daughter. She learned which doors she could use and which belonged to the family alone. On Sundays, she sat near the back of the Harrow pew at St. Andrew's, an extra shadow among lace and frock coats, nameless in the parish register. And yet, in the small gaps between rules, a different story grew. It appears in tiny accounting entries. C's primer, extra blanket for C, C's teeth, dentist. It appears in a line from a letter. Margaret has taken it upon herself to teach Catherine to sew properly. Their heads bent together at the work table moved me more than I let on. It appears most vividly in a passage Eleanor wrote late one night. I find her sometimes standing by the parlor window after the others have gone up, looking out at the street lamps as if they were stars. When she notices me, she straightens, hands clasped just so, like the maids do when they expect to be corrected. I tell her she may sit, that the chair will not shatter under her. It will take time before she believes me. That image, the girl at the window, half in shadow, half in borrowed light, rewrites the photograph once you know it. The position in the portrait was not random. It was a place she already knew, a vantage point from which she had learned to occupy space without claiming it. The decision to include her in the formal sitting came months later, and even then it was contested. Thomas saw no need. "She is not family," he wrote in a note to Eleanor. "The portrait is for our descendants, not for charity." Eleanor pushed back with uncharacteristic firmness. "Our descendants deserve to know the full measure of what we have done," she replied. "Good and bad. The compromise was the pose we see. The photographer, a professional used to translating social hierarchies into arrangement, would have understood the instructions without needing them spelled out. The Harrows in the center, father upright, mother seated, legitimate children arranged in age order. Catherine by the window, present but offset, in plain clothes that did not compete, at a distance that made it easy for a casual viewer to ignore her. She was both inside and outside the story the family told about itself. In the weeks after the portrait, the household adjusted itself around Catherine's continued presence. The account books show her moving from provision to school fees. Eleanor's letters shift from calling her the O'Malley girl to Catherine, then, tentatively, our Catherine. The servants began leaving small treats on her pillow, a leftover bun, a borrowed novel, gestures of solidarity from people who understood living in someone else's house under someone else's rules. Outside the Harrow home, however, she remained invisible. The mill workers whispered about her, about the owner's guilt, about a child lifted from the tenements into silk and mahogany. Some saw it as an insult more than a kindness. "What about the rest of us?" one union man wrote in a letter to an editor. "Do our dead not leave children worth a place by such windows?" In that resentment, you can feel the limits of what the Harrows were willing or able to do. They had plucked one life from the wreckage their factory had helped create. The others they left to institutions and the grinding mercy of underfunded charities. Back in the archive a century later, Amelia traced Catherine's liminal life through these fragments with a mixture of sympathy and fury. Here was a girl who had lost everything and gained a kind of golden cage, a life of almosts, almost daughter, almost servant, almost equal. The documentary would have to walk that line too. It could not paint the Harrows as simple villains. Their actions, by the standards of their time, were unusually generous. But it also could not excuse the way they folded Catherine into their home while keeping her carefully folded out of their public identity. For the viewer, Chapter 3 would be where the camera leaves the snapshot and steps into the rooms around it, watching Catherine learn the choreography of belonging and exclusion. Her first hesitant attempts to eat with the right fork, while the nursemaid whispers instructions in her ear. The way she flinches when Thomas enters a room, unsure whether his glance will bring a pat on the head or a pointed reminder of her place. The scene where young Henry, tired of being told no, drags her by the hand into a family game of charades, only for Eleanor to freeze, torn between correcting her son and protecting the fragile equilibrium. Always, at the edge of these scenes, the window waits. A recurring visual. Catherine's reflection superimposed on the street outside, half ghost, half witness. And on Amelia's desk, the photograph sits, its grainy surface suddenly crowded with context. The girl at the glass is no longer an anomaly in the background. She is the hinge on which the whole story turns, the quiet, uncredited protagonist of a narrative the Harrows never meant anyone to tell. The next chapter will follow what happens when that uneasy arrangement collides with the outside world of labor unrest, charity boards, and a society not ready to admit that a factory girl's daughter might sit even just by the window, in a mill owner's parlor. By the time the Harrows finally decided what to do with Catherine, the photograph of her standing by the window had already taken on a life of its own inside the house. It hung, framed in dark wood, in Thomas Harrow's study. Not because he was sentimental about family portraits, he wasn't, but because clients and colleagues expected to see such things behind a man of his position. It was a sort of visual resume, proof that he had done precisely what a successful mill owner should do. Build a business, acquire a fine house, produce heirs. Visitors rarely looked closely. They saw the center, Thomas and Eleanor, Edward and Rose and little Henry. They registered the piano, the rug, the oil paintings. They nodded, satisfied. The story the picture told them was the one they already believed. But people who lived in the house saw more. Henry, especially, had begun to make a game of it. Whenever one of his father's business associates came to call, he'd stand quietly by the door and watch their eyes travel over the frame. "They never see her," he whispered once to Rose when the door closed behind a departing banker. "Not really. It's like she's invisible until you know where to look." Rose, now a teenager with an increasingly sharp sense of what society did and did not allow, shushed him. "Don't say that where Father can hear," she warned. "He already thinks Eleanor has made too much of the arrangement." Catherine discovered her own presence in the photograph by accident. She had been dusting the study one afternoon under the housekeeper's supervision, a compromise task that acknowledged her limbo status. Not a servant, but expected to contribute. As she wiped gently at the frame with a cloth, her reflection merged with the image, and for a moment she saw two versions of herself layered together. The girl standing in the 1909 parlor, and the one staring back from 1912. She froze. The child in the photograph looked slightly smaller, the dress plainer, the eyes wider. But there was no mistaking her. No mistaking either the way she stood apart, unclaimed. "Don't linger," the housekeeper murmured, misreading the moment. "Mr. Harrow doesn't like fingerprints on the glass." Catherine swallowed and moved on. But some boundary inside her had shifted. Until then, she had half believed that her life in the Harrow house was something temporary, precarious, subject to erasure. Now she had proof that, at least once, they had allowed the camera, and thus the future, to see her. She existed, even if the census refused to say so. Outside the walls of the Commonwealth Avenue house, the world was changing faster than the Harrows or Catherine could track. Textile workers across New England were talking more openly about safety and compensation. Reformers were publishing pamphlets with titles like "The Human Cost of Cotton." Legislators in Massachusetts debated factory inspection laws. In parlors not unlike Eleanor's, respectable ladies formed committees and read heart-rending reports about widows and orphans. Eleanor joined one such committee, partly from genuine conviction, partly because she understood how much it mattered for women like her to be seen caring. Her involvement with a children's aid society gave her a socially acceptable outlet for the guilt that still flared whenever she passed the mill on her carriage ride into town. It also gave her a way to imagine a future for Catherine that did not end in a boarding school for the poor. In her letters from 1911 and 1912, a new thread appeared: education. "Catherine's lessons with Miss Fairchild are going well," she wrote to her sister. The girl is quick with figures, quicker perhaps, than is comfortable for those who would prefer her to remain grateful and unquestioning. I have raised the possibility of formal schooling with Thomas. He insists that sending her to the same academy as Rose would invite speculation. But the thought of consigning her to some charity institution when she is capable of more feels intolerable. Thomas's objections were not entirely cold. He worried about appearances, yes, but also about fairness, or at least about how fairness would be perceived. If we send the O'Malley girl to a fine school, he argued in a note Amelia later found among his papers, what will the other workers say? That we value her more than their own children? That the only path to advancement is to die under our machines? Charity must be broad, not personal. Charity, Eleanor replied on the same sheet, already favors the visible. We cannot repair the world at once. We can do right by the child in front of us. In the end, as so often, she won by degrees. They did not adopt Catherine. Thomas would not allow it. Adoption in his mind implied equality of name and expectation he wasn't prepared to grant. But he agreed, grudgingly, to send her to a respectable girls' school under the designation ward. It was an in-between category, understood by headmistresses and registrars as someone we are responsible for but do not claim entirely. For Catherine, it was both promotion and reminder. On her first day, walking up the steps of the academy beside Rose, she wore a new dress accounted for in Eleanor's books as C's gray wool, suitable for school. It was well made but simpler than Rose's, lacking the extra ruffles and embroidery. Her satchel was plain, her gloves sturdy rather than delicate. Rose, catching the difference, slipped her arm through Catherine's. If anyone asks, she murmured, you are with us? Let Father worry about the wording. Inside, under the gaze of portraits of graduates and benefactors, Catherine sat at a desk for the first time in a room full of girls whose fathers owned things instead of operating them. She learned Latin declensions and algebraic equations. She discovered that the world on the pages of books was both bigger and more forgiving than the one that had killed her mother. Yet even here, liminality followed her. On school forms, she was Catherine Harrow, ward. On class lists, occasionally, the ward was dropped by busy teachers. At year's end, prizes were read aloud. Miss Harrow, Rose for composition, Miss Catherine H. for mathematics, the initial trailing off into polite ambiguity. In the Harrow house, the photograph on the wall watched all of this. There is a note, buried in the margins of Eleanor's 1912 account book, that Amelia couldn't stop thinking about. Next to an entry for portrait cleaning, Eleanor had scribbled, "Must speak to Whitcomb about new photograph, Catherine's position." No such second photograph survives in the archive. Whether another sitting happened and was lost, or whether Thomas vetoed the idea, we can't know. But the impulse to reposition Catherine, literally and figuratively, was there. For Amelia's documentary, this tension became the spine of Chapter 4. We see Catherine's world expanding, classrooms, libraries, arguments with Rose about suffrage and socialism, while the frame that first captured her remains static in the study. We watch Eleanor struggle to stretch the boundaries of what her class will permit, and Thomas try to keep those boundaries from unraveling entirely. In one imagined scene drawn from phrases in their letters, Eleanor stands alone in the study at dusk, looking at the photograph. "She's too far away," she says when Thomas comes in behind her. "She is where she belongs," he replies automatically, then stops. The words sound harsher than he intended. "Does she?" Eleanor asks. "You put her in this house because a machine in yours broke and killed her mother. You let me keep her because you feared what it would mean to send her back to the tenements. She has done everything we have asked, learned our manners, studied our books, stayed silent about where she came from, unless spoken to. Tell me, Thomas, how far does she have to walk before you let her stand with the others?" He does not answer, because there is no answer that will satisfy both his conscience and his class. That, ultimately, is what makes the Harrow story more than a neat parable about good mill owners and grateful orphans. It is a story about people trying to do the right thing while still desperately clinging to the structures that made the wrong thing possible. For Catherine, the stakes are simpler and sharper. She is trying to survive, to build a life from the contradictory materials handed to her. A factory death and a parlor window, a doll bought with guilt, and a scholarship paid from dividends. The chapter comes full circle in the present, with Amelia. In the archive reading room, surrounded by ledger books and letters, she pins Xeroxed copies of the photograph to a foam board. On one, she circles Catherine's figure in red. On another, she overlays transparencies of account entries, newspaper clippings, school records. To most viewers, the old photo will still look at first like a standard family portrait. Amelia's job, and yours as the storyteller, is to teach them where to look. To show that the most important person in the image is not the man with the waistcoat or the girl with the lace collar, but the child standing just inside the light, at the edge of acceptance. The next, final chapter will follow Catherine beyond the Harrow house entirely, into college, into a career, into the strange freedom of a life that owes its beginning to a moment her benefactors tried both to commemorate and to conceal. But the photograph will remain where it began, on the wall, frozen in 1909, a permanent reminder that even carefully staged images can't quite hide the people a society would rather keep by the window than at the table.